The Hollywood lights shimmered brightly outside the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio as the audience buzzed with excitement. Tonight's guest was none other than the legendary action star, the man who brought Rocky Balboa and John Rambo to life, Sylvester Stallone. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his sharp wit and light-hearted roasting of celebrities, was already rubbing his hands together in anticipation. He had prepared a few jokes aimed at Stallone, expecting the action icon to take them in stride. After all, it was all in good fun. The cameras rolled, the band played, and Jimmy Kimmel strutted onto the stage with his usual energy. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest tonight," Jimmy began, flashing his trademark grin. "This man has been in more fights than Mike Tyson and married more women than Tom Brady. Give it up for the one and only Sylvester Stallone." The crowd erupted in cheers as Stallone walked out clad in a sleek black leather jacket and his signature swagger. He nodded at the crowd, smiled, and shook hands with Jimmy before taking his seat. "Wow, look at this guy," Jimmy quipped as Stallone adjusted his seat. "Still looking like he could beat me up. Not that that's hard, I get winded opening a jar of peanut butter." Stallone chuckled, his deep voice rumbling through the mic. "Jimmy, I gotta be honest, if this is gonna be a roast, you better bring something stronger than peanut butter, pal." The audience roared with laughter, sensing that Stallone wasn't about to take Jimmy's jokes lying down. Kimmel, ever the comedian, leaned in with a smirk. All right, let's get into it. Stallone, you've made like 8 Rocky movies and 5 Rambo movies. At what point did you just say, screw it, I'm just gonna fight myself in the next one? The crowd burst out laughing and Jimmy basked in their reaction. Stallone, however, simply leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin as if calculating a counterpunch. Then, with perfect timing, he replied, "That's funny, Jimmy, coming from a guy who's been hosting the same show for 20 years and still can't win an Emmy." The audience went wild, clapping, cheering, even standing up in some cases. Kimmel, taken aback for a moment, put a hand over his heart as if Stallone's joke had physically wounded him. Oh, that's cold, Sly," Jimmy exclaimed, laughing despite himself. "But at least I don't need stunt doubles to do my job." Stallone raised an eyebrow. "No, you just need writers." The crowd lost it. People were howling, some even stomping their feet. The camera panned across the band members who were visibly struggling to keep their composure. Jimmy held up his hands in surrender, laughing. All right, I walked into that one. But come on, Stallone, let's talk about it. You've been in the business for like, 50 years? What's changed the most?" Stallone thought for a second, then grinned. "Well, for starters, back in my day, talk show hosts actually had guts." Jimmy dramatically fell back in his chair, pretending to faint from the burn. The audience was loving every second of this unexpected verbal showdown. But little did Jimmy know this was just the beginning. Stallone had a few more surprises up his sleeve. Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward, shaking his head with a smirk. "All right, Sly, I see what you're doing here. You're trying to out-roast me on my own show. You do realize this is Jimmy Kimmel Live, right?" Stallone, without missing a beat, folded his arms. "Yeah, I do. But considering how this is going, maybe next week it'll be called Sylvester Stallone Live." The audience exploded with laughter, some even chanting Sly. "Sly! Sly!" while Kimmel dramatically wiped imaginary sweat from his forehead. Okay, Jimmy admitted, holding up his hands. "I walked into that one. But let's be real, you're like Hollywood's ultimate tough guy. And yet, I gotta ask, how does it feel knowing that every time someone does an impression of you, it just sounds like a guy trying to order a sandwich with a mouthful of mashed potatoes?" Stallone grinned, nodding as if he saw that joke coming from a mile away. Then he slowly leaned forward, locked eyes with Jimmy, and said in his deepest, most dramatic voice, "Hey, yo Jimmy, you ever think maybe it's not me who sounds like mashed potatoes? Maybe it's just you who's been hearing mashed potatoes your whole life because you keep getting roasted." The crowd lost their minds. The energy in the studio was electric. Kimmel had just walked into another Stallone haymaker. Jimmy, laughing despite himself, dramatically slumped in his chair. "My God. My own show. My own stage. And I'm getting verbally Ramboed." Stallone, now completely in the zone, shrugged. "Hey, you picked this fight, man." Jimmy wiped away imaginary tears, then sat up. All right, let's get serious for a second. I gotta ask, how do you stay in such ridiculous shape at 77 years old? Like, be honest, did you sign a deal with the devil? Or are you just running off the energy of old VHS tapes of Rocky playing in the background? Stallone chuckled. Nah man, it's actually pretty simple. Every morning, I wake up, do some stretches, then I think, how do I make sure I don't end up looking like Jimmy Kimmel? That motivates me. The entire studio erupted. The camera panned to the audience, where some people were literally crying from laughter. Even the band members were doubling over, trying to keep their composure. Kimmel, clutching his chest in mock pain, gasped, "Ladies and gentlemen, Sylvester Stallone, the first guest in history to come on my show and completely destroy me in hand-to-hand combat." Stallone laughed, but before Jimmy could regain control of the conversation, Stallone leaned forward and pointed at him. "Now hold on, Jimmy, I got a question for you." Kimmel, caught off guard, raised his eyebrows. "Oh no. This isn't how this works, Sly. I asked the questions." Stallone smirked. "Yeah, well, tonight it's different. I want to know, how come every time I see you at award shows, you're always sitting in the front row like you won something? What exactly is your talent again?" The crowd exploded, whistles, cheers, laughter, the kind of live TV moment that would get replayed for years to come. Jimmy, now completely speechless, just stared at Stallone, blinking. Then he finally muttered, You absolute monster." Stallone shrugged. "Hey, man. I was trained for combat." At this point, the audience was crying with laughter, and even Jimmy had to admit he was getting completely outclassed in his own game. And little did he know Stallone wasn't done yet. Jimmy Kimmel rubbed his temples, shaking his head as the audience continued to cheer. All right, I get it. You're Sylvester Stallone. You win at everything. But this is my show, okay? I still have control." Stallone smirked, leaned back in his chair, and folded his arms. "Yeah? Then why does it feel like I'm the one running the show now?" The crowd roared again. At this point, it was obvious Jimmy Kimmel was no longer in control of this interview. Jimmy sighed dramatically. Fine, let's reset. I want to talk about your career, Sly. You've played so many iconic characters. Rocky, Rambo, Cobra, Barney Ross. But let's be honest, have you ever had a role where you thought, man, I really should not have done that? Stallone chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, absolutely. You ever hear of a little movie called Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot? The audience laughed, some even clapping in agreement. Jimmy gasped theatrically. Oh my God. You're actually admitting that was a mistake? Stallone nodded. Oh yeah, big mistake. But you know what's even funnier? Jimmy leaned in. What? Stallone smirked. Even that movie got higher ratings than your last season of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The crowd lost it. People were stomping their feet, clapping, laughing hysterically. Jimmy, eyes wide in shock, clutched his heart like he had been stabbed in a movie fight scene. Oh, you really came prepared, huh? Jimmy said, shaking his head with a smirk. Did you spend all week writing these jokes? Stallone pretended to think for a second, then shrugged. Nah, I just spent 5 minutes looking at your show's ratings. Even the camera operators were shaking with laughter at this point. The crowd was completely unhinged. Whistles, applause, even chants of Sly, Sly, Sly. Jimmy sighed dramatically, waving at the audience. Oh great. Now they're on your side. This is mutiny. Stallone grinned. Hey Jimmy, you should be used to that feeling. Didn't your audience switch over to Fallon a long time ago? The loudest laugh of the night erupted. Some people in the front row even jumped out of their seats. Jimmy slumped in his chair, defeated. You know what, Sly? At this point, I'm just gonna let you host the show. Stallone grinned, then suddenly turned to the cameras and imitated Jimmy's voice perfectly. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Jimmy Kimmel Live. I'm your new host, Sylvester Stallone, and tonight's guest is some guy named Jimmy. Let's give him a big round of applause for showing up. Even though he's getting absolutely demolished, the studio erupted in laughter. Jimmy just put his head down on his desk, shaking with laughter. Finally, after a moment, he sat back up, wiped fake tears from his eyes and sighed. You know what, Sly? If you ever get tired of making movies, you should just take over my job. Stallone chuckled. Nah, man. I like jobs with good ratings. Even the camera operators were shaking with laughter at this point. The crowd was completely unhinged. Whistles, applause, even chants of Sly, Sly, Sly. Jimmy sighed dramatically, waving at the audience. Oh great. Now they're on your side. This is mutiny. Stallone grinned. Hey Jimmy, you should be used to that feeling. Didn't your audience switch over to Fallon a long time ago? The loudest laugh of the night erupted. Some people in the front row even jumped out of their seats. Jimmy slumped in his chair, defeated. You know what, Sly? At this point, I'm just gonna let you host the show. Stallone grinned, then suddenly turned to the cameras and imitated Jimmy's voice perfectly. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Jimmy Kimmel Live. I'm your new host, Sylvester Stallone, and tonight's guest is some guy named Jimmy. Let's give him a big round of applause for showing up. Even though he's getting absolutely demolished, the studio erupted in laughter. Jimmy just put his head down on his desk, shaking with laughter. Finally, after a moment, he sat back up, wiped fake tears from his eyes and sighed. You know what, Sly? If you ever get tired of making movies, you should just take over my job. Stallone chuckled. Nah, man. I like jobs with good ratings. The crowd went nuts again. At this point, it was just Stallone victory lap after victory lap. But what happened next? Well, Jimmy had one last trick up his sleeve. Jimmy Kimmel took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and rubbed his hands together like a man preparing for a final battle. All right, Sly, I gotta admit, you've been handing me my own show on a silver platter tonight. But you know what? I'm not going down without a fight. Stallone raised an eyebrow, amused. Oh yeah? You got something left in the tank, Kimmel? Jimmy grinned and pointed at the big screen behind them. Roll the clip. The screen flickered to life and suddenly, a young Sylvester Stallone appeared, shirtless, sweaty, and flexing his muscles in an old 1980s exercise commercial. The crowd burst into laughter as an overly dramatic narrator boomed. Want arms like Stallone? Want abs like Rambo? Then you need the Slyflex 2000, the only workout machine endorsed by the man himself. The clip cut to a ridiculously cheesy scene of young Stallone grunting dramatically while curling weights, his face scrunched up in an over-the-top show of effort. Then, the ad ended with a wildly exaggerated tagline. The Slyflex 2000, because you'll never be Stallone, but you can try. The audience exploded in laughter. Even Stallone couldn't help but chuckle, shaking his head as he watched his younger self on screen. Jimmy pounced on the moment. So, Sly, tell us, how many of those did you sell? 3? 4? Maybe 1 to your mom? Stallone smirked, nodding as if he was impressed. Okay, I gotta give it to you. That was a good one. Jimmy leaned forward, grinning. I mean, come on, Sly. That was one of the most ridiculous workout commercials I've ever seen. You had more oil on your body than an Italian pizza. Stallone laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, well, at least I was selling something people wanted. What's your excuse? Boom. Another verbal punch to the face. The audience erupted once again. Jimmy clutched his chest, dramatically falling back in his chair. Damn it. I almost had you. And then you got me again. Stallone shrugged. Hey man, you should have known better. I don't lose fights. The audience cheered wildly, some even chanting Stallone's name again. It was clear, Jimmy had made a valiant effort, but Stallone was still firmly in control. But just when Jimmy thought it was over, Stallone leaned in one last time and said, You know, Jimmy, that was actually a pretty good attempt at revenge. But if you really wanted to get back at me, you should have just played clips from your first season. The biggest laugh of the night. The crowd went absolutely insane. Jimmy, completely defeated, waved his arms in surrender. All right, I give up. You win, Stallone. I got destroyed on my own show. Stallone grinned, reached over, and patted Jimmy on the back. Hey, don't feel bad, kid. Even Apollo Creed got knocked down a few times. The crowd roared once again as Jimmy sighed. Yeah, but at least he got a rematch. Stallone laughed. You want a rematch? I'll see you next time. But next time, bring a helmet. The audience cheered wildly as the segment wrapped up and Jimmy turned to the camera, shaking his head. Ladies and gentlemen, Sylvester Stallone, the only guest in history to host my show better than I do. The band kicked in and the screen faded to commercial, but the moment had already become legendary. As the show returned from the commercial break, the audience was still buzzing from the absolute verbal smackdown Stallone had just delivered. Jimmy Kimmel, still massaging his ego, took a deep breath and turned to the camera. Alright folks, I think we just witnessed history. Never in my life have I been so thoroughly beaten on my own show. He turned to Stallone, shaking his head. Sly, you are a savage. I invite you as a guest and instead you turned this into a live-action Rocky match. Stallone grinned. Hey Jimmy, I told you picked this fight. I just made sure you knew the score. Jimmy leaned forward, tapping the desk. Alright, before we wrap this up, I gotta ask, you've done it all. Boxing legend in movies, action icon, Hollywood powerhouse, and now the undisputed roast champion of late-night TV. But is there anything left on your bucket list? Stallone pretended to think for a second, then nodded. You know, Jimmy, I was actually thinking, maybe it's time for me to enter politics. The crowd gasped and then erupted into cheers. Jimmy's eyes widened. Wait, are you serious? Like President Stallone? Stallone smirked. Hey, if guys like you can have late-night shows, then yeah, why not? Boom. Another knockout punch. The audience exploded once again, some people even standing up and clapping. Jimmy slumped back in his chair. I give up. This man is unstoppable. Somebody call the Secret Service. I think Stallone just staged a live takeover of the United States. Stallone laughed. Nah man. I'm just saying if I ever ran for office, my slogan would be simple, keep punching, America. The entire studio erupted into cheers and applause with some audience members chanting, Sly for president. Sly for president. Jimmy threw his cue cards in the air. That's it. I'm done. Stallone has officially taken over America and I'm just here to witness it. Stallone chuckled and stood up, waving to the crowd like a true champion. Then, just as he was about to walk off the stage, he turned back to Jimmy and delivered one final blow. Oh, and Jimmy, don't worry. When I take over, I'll make sure you still have a job. Jimmy, shaking his head with a smirk, sighed. As long as I get to be your press secretary. Stallone grinned. Yeah, we'll see about that. With that, Stallone walked off stage, the band playing the iconic Rocky theme song as the audience gave him a standing ovation. Jimmy turned to the camera one last time, shaking his head with a smile. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was Sylvester Stallone, legendary actor, action icon, and the man who just absolutely roasted me for 30 straight minutes on live TV. He sighed dramatically, then grinned. I'll be recovering in therapy. See you tomorrow night. Fade to black.